Hello everybody, it's been a long time since I reviewed a book, so here I am. These are some of the books I've read recently. I plan to review all of them. I'll start with the top one, which is Novelist as a Vocation, and this is by Murakami, or Haruki Murakami. Never read any of his stuff before this. I know he's very famous for having written Norwegian Wood, and I mean this is one of the few writers where I've seen people actually walking around with T-shirts with his, novel on them. So I figure he's pretty popular, right? And he is an internationally best-selling author. So I walked into a bookstore and saw this because it was on the suggested reading table from where I often get my books, and picked it up. And on the front it says every creative person should read this book. I like to think I'm a little bit creative, so I thought, okay, I should read this book, right? That's by the literary review. And then I read the back of it, which got me more interested. It says the New York Times bestseller, my God, I can't speak, a unique look at the craft of writing from a master of storytelling. In this engaging book, Haruki Murakami shares his experience as an internationally best-selling author, his thoughts on the role of the novel in our society, his own origins as a writer, and his musings on the sparks of creativity that inspire other writers, artists, and musicians. Readers who have long wondered where this mysterious novelist gets his ideas will be fascinated by this highly personal look at the craft of writing. Alright, that seems pretty good, right? You end this collection of beautiful essays vowing to never let life or writing get so complicated again. That's by The Guardian and the Sunday Times. Right, it's a fascinating glimpse of the peculiar writerly life. Writerly. I'm not sure if that's a real word or one that's just been made up. Murakami is like a magician who explains what he's doing as he performs a trick and still makes you believe he has supernatural powers. That's a better review. That's by New York Times Book Review. And it was written originally in Japanese, translated by Philip Gabriel and Ted Gusen. I found this really, really interesting. Like I said, I'd never read any of his stuff before, but I like the way he writes. And I didn't know anything about him other than he's a novelist, as you might know, Napoleon, historical figure, but you don't know anything about him. You just know he was a historical figure, a general or whatever, right? He started off in the 60s running a jazz cafe when there was a lot of rebellion in Tokyo, and people could start their own businesses, and he struggled for a long time. He got married at a young age, and then one day he says he's a big baseball fan. He was at a baseball game, and the idea just fell upon him to write a novel. And he said it was a bit like catching the baseball. It just lands in your glove and you think, great. So he just thought, right, I'm going to write a novel. And then he went home, he'd run the jazz cafe, it's his own business, still in lots of debt, lots of hours he had to work, just to make it work. And he'd sit up at night writing a novel. And he says he prefers to write longhand, writing rather than typing, which I thought was interesting because I always thought it was easier to be creative and to express your ideas with a pen or a pencil and paper than it is at a laptop. That may be down to the fact, this is my theory anyway, that when I went to school there weren't laptops, so my early experiences of learning, of expressing myself, were always with a pen or a pencil, and so that is a more natural channel into my my thoughts, my creative thoughts. It's a more direct channel because I also had to learn to use a laptop, so that's another layer of learning upon, which is on top of the expression of the thoughts. That's my thoughts anyway. And yeah, I found this great. The one thing I learned about Murakami is he makes up his stories as he goes along, which I thought was fascinating because I've written before, and I'll plan everything out and just write it. So I thought, let me give this a shot. So I started writing a story and I just make it up as I go along. It's actually great fun. So if you are a writer or you want to be a writer and you'd never thought about just making things up as you go along, give it a shot. I did after reading this book, and I'm enjoying the process. And actually what I'm writing that way is much longer than what I usually write, because when I'm usually writing I know where it's going, so I get there pretty quick. It's quite lean, there's no fat on the bones, but fat can be good in a novel, I think. So that's one thing. The other thing you learn about Murakami is he has a very strict routine which he sticks to in order to be able to write. which involves daily exercise. He gets up and runs every day. He's written a book on running as well, I think, or a novel about a runner. I don't know, I haven't read it yet. It's just something during the course of reading the book I looked at. So exercise is important for him, and he writes every single day like a job, and he doesn't get out much. You know, he's not into parties and everything. So it's sort of admirable the amount of work and discipline he puts into it. And he's been writing for 30 years now. You know, to keep anything going for that long is quite admirable, I think. He says writing's a bit like a wrestling ring that anybody can enter. Yeah, you show up, and the seasoned wrestlers will all look at you and they'll say, "Come then, let's see what you got." And most people will get in, take a beating, and disappear and never come back, or they'll come in, win a fight, and then disappear and never come back. To stick at it takes something. He thinks regular exercise, running, is an important part of that. He doesn't really associate with other writers. He doesn't know other writers, he says. So he doesn't know how they work, how they think, but this is the method that works for him, his method. So I think if you have a method that works for you at anything, then stick at it. And maybe, you know, that probably applies to creative endeavors more than, you know, things which have a greater basis in science, like exercise. Don't just go to a gym and start throwing around dumbbells or whatever with no idea what you're doing. See what the other people are doing, seek some advice, or you might injure yourself. You're not going to injure yourself with writing, right? So that was interesting. And then also his thoughts on critics. Critics, he says, have always been very harsh, and he just ignores them. Because at the end of the day, he's the one doing the writing. Initially, it used to get to him, it used to bother him. He was a young writer, unsure of himself. But then Norwegian Wood, by the time he wrote Norwegian Wood, he decided to sell the Jazz Cafe against the advice of all his peers and friends and family and everybody else. But he thought if he's going to do this, he has to really do it. The whole idea of burning bridges comes up here in my mind. And he lived all over Europe, living in hotels and everything, and just wrote the novel as he was going. And it's the one that has made him the most money out of everything. So good on him, you know. I do think, though, there's more examples in life of people who burned all the bridges and took a big risk and failed miserably and went down and never recovered. But you don't hear about those. You only hear about the successes. But this is one of the successes. So that's not to take anything away from him. I think it's very admirable. And a good writer. I enjoyed the book. I do think this review is suffering a bit because I've read about 4 more books since I read this. But I recommend this book. I'd give it a, I was going to say 10, but something makes me want to say 7 out of 10. I think I enjoyed it a great deal because I like writing. I'm interested in writing. I'm interested in writers. So for me, it's a 10 out of 10, but I give it a 7 out of 10. Well written. It's a nice autobiographical piece as well. He talks about originality in here as well. See, this book was originally a series of essays. Somebody in Japan came up with a magazine. They contacted him and said, "Would you write for the magazine, write about writing?" He said, "Okay." And then the first 4 chapters, I think, are articles he wrote for that magazine. What are the first 4 chapters in here? Let's see. And then the rest are ones he just wrote as and when afterwards. So the chapters here are Novelist Broad-Minded, When I Became a Novelist, on literary prizes. He's never won one literary prize in Japan, which bothered him a bit, but he's been shortlisted. On originality, so what should I write about? Making Time Your Ally. That's about his whole routine. I mean, as a writer, I think if you want to succeed as a writer, or if you want to succeed in anything in life, you should just do it every single day. If you look at all the people who are great at something, right? So let's think of musicians, and I play guitar, and a lot of the time I speak with other friends of mine who are guitarists, and oh my God, how did they get so good? Well, they do it every single day for hours and hours because it's their job. Now, it only became their job by them doing it for a long time as well, but I'd say if it hadn't become their job and they hadn't been able to make a living from it, they would no longer be doing it for 7, 8, 9, 10 hours a day. You do anything for that long, that regularly, you're going to get really good. Okay? So, Making Time Your Ally. A completely personal and physical occupation. Regarding schools, what kind of character should I include? Who do I write for? Going abroad, a new frontier. It's a really interesting one. On originality is a good one. He really likes jazz music, and he remembers when he first heard the Beatles, and it was something memorable, it was something unique, it was something really, really good, And now, 50 years later, you listen to the Beatles and they still sound really good. And then there are other hundreds and hundreds of bands who come and go. And he says the elements of originality and something that makes you go, wow, I've never heard anything like that before. And if you imagine what it was like in the 60s when music, it wasn't easy to listen to new music. Now everybody's got their smartphones or whatever, they download and listen to whatever they want. And too much choice makes you realize or makes you unable to really appreciate how good something is, because there's a thousand other things. It took no effort whatsoever to acquire this thing. Even me, I'm a massive music fan, but I miss having to go out and look for CDs, or having to order them, or wait for something, or go to the store. That actually made the buying experience and even the listening experience more enjoyable, as far as I'm concerned. Choice is not the greatest thing. I think choice falls under the aggregation fallacy, which is the idea that if anything is good, choice is good. Then the more of it you have, the better. But that's not the case. And that's actually something I learned about in this book. No, is this? Yeah, this is the one, How to Think Like a Philosopher. And I have a brilliant book which I shall review shortly. But for now, I'll wrap up by saying, great book. I guess if you're a Murakami fan, you might enjoy this even more than I enjoyed it, not having read any of his stuff. But it's a really nice introduction to Murakami if you haven't read any of his stuff. And I'll recommend it. I'll give it a 7 out of 10. All right, thank you.